In this video, I want to talk about storytelling, and I want to bring up the question of, is photography storytelling? This is a term that you hear a lot, and it's been used and probably overused quite a bit in the last 10 to 20 years. And anytime you take something out of its original context, so normally we associate storytelling with things like literature, filmmaking, theater, and you take it out of that context and apply it to something else, it sounds very poetic. So you could say, I'm a painter, but what I really am is a storyteller. Or photography is not about just taking pictures, it's about storytelling. Or if you hear somebody, I've even heard it in far out things like, I'm not an accountant, I'm really a storyteller. And so anyway, it gets bizarre sometimes, but I'm concerned about photography, and this is what I want to bring the question up today with. And photography is many things, and I think that's what I love so much about photography. There are elements of chemistry, optics, physics, digital technologies, and then you combine those with artistic things like a creative approach, use of metaphor, just different things you can do with light, visual components, where you start to communicate visually. And so what role does storytelling play? Because photography is a pretty wide landscape, and there are a lot of different elements that constitute what we define as photography. So I will give you an example, and I'm going to approach this from a couple different angles here to raise the question. If you look at types of photography that are associated traditionally, very creatively with the art world, with past master paintings. So for instance, traditional landscapes or still lifes. Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams was a brilliant photographer. I have nothing but the utmost respect for everything that he did. I would not call him a storyteller. When I look at those pieces, there's so many things going on, and what he was able to do to bring a visual landscape with challenging lighting conditions and a wide dynamic range into making that work between film and paper and making a black and white print. And there's some beautiful prints that he did. I just don't consider that to be storytelling. I'm not being told a story there. I think still life is the same thing. I think you can put that into the commercial world. In general, product photography, if you're just shooting a product against a white background, that's not really storytelling, for instance. You might even challenge portraiture. Richard Avedon was very poetic talking about the way that he worked, and he was one of the great portrait photographers of all time, and he always claimed that there had to be this magic coming from the subject's eyes, and if there wasn't interest in the eyes, then it was more difficult, and he wasn't interested in the photograph. And so being able to draw or tell the story of the person that you're photographing, well, whose story are you telling? Are you really telling their story, or are you imposing your own story onto that? So where is the storytelling component there? If you've ever done portraiture or portrait photography, you will know that sometimes, especially if you're being very experimental about it, people will have problems with the way they look later, and whose interpretation and what is the story and where is that coming from. So I think that's particularly questioning as well. If you look at something that's not artistic at all, like for instance forensic photography, if you're on a crime scene, you are capturing details, and one could argue that you are putting together all the little pieces of a story that's going on. However, I would tell you that there's no one in the legal field at all that would ever describe that as storytelling, because the whole idea of storytelling has an implication that maybe it was creatively embellished or something was made up. Another big, I think, key to this is if you look at photojournalism, and really traditionally photojournalism, maybe illustrative is a better word. Some of the classic Eugene Smith spreads that he did for Life magazine, for instance, The Country Doctor, that were they were designed to go with written text, so it was more of an illustration assignment perhaps, although they do speak on their own, which I find very interesting about them. Is that storytelling? If you maybe abstracted that a little bit and you look at somebody like Dave Heath, who I've talked about recently, who was very inspired by Eugene Smith, was what he was doing storytelling? Because there's not always an obvious story that's going on. There are relationships between the photographs, and maybe that's the subjects, maybe that's a sense of shape or geometry or lighting, or there's something that makes that happen, and it could be maybe a more abstract element of storytelling. So that's another possibility. So there's all these different kinds of possibilities as to what storytelling is or isn't, or what that's interpreted as, or whether that's a good thing or whether that's a bad thing. And I think this is what's really interesting about photography. And I want to give you an example of somebody who I think was an excellent traditional storyteller in photography in a fine art context. And he's a photographer I haven't talked about much on the show, but he's a gentleman in New York by the name of Dwayne Michaels, who is in his 80s now. He is a brilliant photographer. I had the opportunity to hear him speak a couple times many years ago, and I just thought very highly of him. The way he thought, the way he approached his work, the way he approached essentially telling a story. And there were a couple different things things about his aesthetic or his style that are really important. One of which is that he was very influenced by surrealism. And so a lot of times, giving you an image of something and then telling you that it's not, for instance. There's a lot of still images that are just single images, and he uses his own handwriting on the bottom of the print to shift your attention into, oh, I saw it this way, but he's telling me it's this. And I find that very interesting, and maybe that's an element of storytelling. But another thing that he's stylistically known for are these series pieces that he did called sequences. And the sequence it's usually 6 photographs that are laid out in kind of a comic strip fashion, and they illustrate, just through a series of frames, almost like a storyboard for a film, they tell a story. And one of these, and actually it's really interesting because I think they're challenging to show in a video, but there's one called Chance Meeting that I find particularly brilliant. And if you think of a story as something that is a timeline-based situation that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and how is that done visually? And what he does is, through this little storyboard of these 6 images, he gives you a very simple act of 2 gentlemen passing each other on the street. They look at each other, they walk away, one turns around to look at the other. So there's a beginning, a middle, end, and in the last frame, you arguably have a coda, which is he's walked on, but then the first guy secondly looks back. So it's a very simple action, but it tells a story. Some of his pieces are more poetic than this, but this is, I think, the classic example because it's just stripped down. It's your basic story, beginning, middle, end. And I think that's brilliant, and I think this is an example of something that is storytelling. Anyway, I hear this term a lot, and so I wanted to bring that up for discussion, and I want to know what you guys have to say. So please leave me a comment. And is photography storytelling? Is it always about storytelling? Are there what ifs? Are there yes buts? I think that's what makes this an interesting conversation to have. If you guys enjoyed this video, please remember to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe. So you'll always be up to date on all the latest, greatest videos that I do. Until the next, I'll see you then. Later.